Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And we are addressing one of the biggest questions. I'm delighted to have two incredibly big thinkers here to join me to talk about it. Conrad's already introduced them, so I won't run through them again. But I'm going to start with you, Frank, because I think if we're going to talk about liberalism, we ought to know what it is. So what's your working definition?
So my definition of liberalism is pretty expansive. In Europe, it tends to refer to center-right parties that are pro-free market, and that's not my definition, nor is it the American understanding of liberalism, which is basically left of center. I think that liberalism builds on a philosophical tradition that sees human societies as collections of autonomous individuals. These individuals are, they're equal, and the humanity that they share is something that's universal to all human beings. Those human beings need to be protected in their basic rights, and in a liberal society, you do them by having a state that protects those rights through a rule of law, in some cases through constitutional mechanisms that limit power. And so one of the chief characteristics of a liberal society is the fact that the state cannot do anything that it wants. It really has to observe the limits of law. I think that historically, liberalism has also been closely associated with a certain cognitive style, which is that of modern natural science. And so there's an assumption that liberals have that there is an external reality. We can perceive that, we can measure it, we can experiment with it, and we can use the methods of modern natural science to both understand that external world and to manipulate it, which then gives rise to modern technology and the kind of economic growth that, that technology brings. And so I believe there's also a kind of meliorative trend in liberalism, because liberals believe that society can actually get better. So they're reformists, they're usually not revolutionary, but they do believe that institutions can be improved and that human behavior in certain ways can be shaped, but fundamentally people are free to, to make choices on their own.
John, so you've got a vision there of liberalism, which is, the idea of a perfectible state, the idea of the arc of history is long, but it bends towards freedom. Is that a definition that you accept?
I think of liberalism to start with, not as a philosophy or a set of principles, but actually as a way of life, one that emerged in modern Europe out of the wars of religion, established itself in some European countries and spread to some other countries in the world. But it was a particular way of life with particular origins in religion and conflicts of religion, and in particular, I think, in the Reformation, in Christianity, and before that in Judaism. So it's a particular historical way of life which later on, maybe even then, claimed to be universal. And it claimed that universality in a way all the way through the intervening years, but that universality then seemed to be vindicated by the end of the Cold War. And perhaps we'll come on to that later, but I rejected that interpretation because the Cold War, I thought, was a very unusual binary conflict in the world. Actually, lots of countries weren't in it. Lots of countries were non-aligned or detached from it, but it was a binary conflict between two European Enlightenment ideologies. And one of them collapsed, communism, and the state collapsed. The other seemed to be triumphant, but I don't think was even triumphant at the time that it seemed to be, because I don't actually think that the collapse of communism had very much to do with liberalism. It was more to do with, who brought down, which forces brought down the Soviet state? Religion, the Catholic Church in Poland. Solidarity, a working class trade union. National self-government in the Baltic states and in Poland. Actually, that, along with Gorbachev's fanciful notion that the Soviet state could be reformed and turned into something like 1960s Sweden, was what brought down the Soviet state. But I do share Frank's broad understanding of what liberalism is or was. And I think the idea, not perhaps of perfectibility, because I don't think most liberals have ever had an idea of a perfect society. So they could say, this is the perfection we're trying to see. I think most liberals, certainly the liberal I spent 20 long years studying when I was an academic, John Stuart Mill, a man without a single joke, by the way, in his writings. It was a long, difficult 2 decades. He didn't have an idea of a permanent society, but he did have an idea which he said, man, he used that sexist, but that's what he said, so that's what I quote, man as a progressive being. Humans are essentially, quintessentially progressive in that they want to improve themselves, they want to become better than they are, and they go on doing it. And this is the key, and this is where I'll leave it. Liberals believe that there can be something like the cumulative advance in science and technology, which is undoubtedly real. That's why we're all sitting here, most of us without masks. It's vaccination that did that, not an improvement in human nature. It was science and technology which allowed us to do that. But liberals believe that the established fact, if you like, of cumulative advance, moving on piecemeal, incrementally, in a melioristic kind of gradual way, in which there are periods of decline, but not everything is lost. And then the advance continues. They think that that sort of advance, which is absolutely real in science and technology, can be replicated in ethics and politics. So the key claim of liberals, I don't think you can be a liberal and not believe this, is that over time, perhaps a long time, over the long run, not just a few societies here and there can practice something like a liberal way of life for a while, and then it vanishes. But that, which I think is the truth of the matter, but that humankind as a whole can advance, become more rational, and not lose what was gained before, but carry it on to ever greater heights. So I think liberalism and that idea of progress, not perfectibility, but progress, are very closely linked.
Well, after your brutal diss of John Stuart Mill, I'm tempted to say, tell us your best joke about liberalism. But I'll come back.
Well, actually, there was one. There is one joke in John Stuart Mill, except I'm not sure he was aware that he was making it when he wrote it. In his autobiography, he describes a mental breakdown he had in his late teens. And he had a very complicated relationship with his father, and he wrote of his father, James Mill, a rather dour utilitarian. He said, my father believed that if a whole range of rather improbable reforms were implemented, human life might become worth living, semicolon. But he never displayed any enthusiasm at this prospect. That might be a joke, I don't know.
But I want to drill down into this, Frank, because I think one of the things that's interesting, John did refer to liberalism as a worldview, and it's always interesting to talk about the deeper currents that perhaps lead us to political positions. Do you think fundamentally you're an optimist and John's a pessimist? And does that come out of the circumstances of your life, the time when you were born, any of that?
I don't think that optimism or pessimism are like ideologies. They're more mental tendencies. But, I am subject to great bouts of pessimism when world conditions look really bad. And right now they're not looking so good. And I think in certain ways it is very hard to be optimistic about the future of liberalism as a doctrine, about liberal democracy around the world, because we've now gone through a 15, 16-year period where that world has contracted. You've had the rise of dictators, of great powers, and I think it would be foolish to pretend that that trend is probably not going to go on. And the latest example of that, obviously, being the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I do think, however, that if you take a sufficiently long historical view of the phenomenon of liberalism, there is some grounds for optimism. I would say that so I agree with John that it did arise in a particular cultural context in the West. We could actually go into its religious roots, because I do think it does have an origin in the Judeo-Christian tradition. But its biggest selling point is actually a pragmatic one, right? That after the Protestant Reformation, you have 150 years of religious warfare between Protestants and Catholics and different sects of each religion. 30 years war kills maybe a third of the population of Central Europe. And at the end of this, you get liberal thinkers that say, hey, maybe it's not such a great idea to tightly bound a community around one set of ideas about what the good life is, what the ultimate purpose of life is, as a religion would do. Maybe what we ought to do is focus on survival in a diverse society in which we tolerate people that are fundamentally different from us, and build rules so that we can all live in peace with one another, and therefore lower the temperature of politics. And I think that it's that pragmatic aspect of liberalism, I think, that is its main selling point. So it occurs first in the 17th century after the wars of religion, but then it next has to deal with nationalism in the 19th and early 20th century. You go through two horrendous world wars in Europe in which there's this assertion of national identity that's aggressive and not at all inclusive. And then at the end of all that destruction, once again, people say, hey, maybe we should not build our states around, a folk or a certain ethnicity. Maybe we should have a liberal society in which we can tolerate people that are fundamentally different. And so I think that, liberalism has, in a way, been defeated in the short term, and then it's come back because it does have this pragmatic characteristic of allowing societies that are diverse in either by religion or nation or ethnicity or other characteristics to actually work together. And then, since it's also tied to a certain set of rights having to do with property rights and contract enforcement and law, it also makes people rich, and the richest societies, the first ones to really break out of this Malthusian cycle that human beings have been in for the last, 50,000 years, were liberal societies. And I think that means that they're not going to go away because that's a pretty powerful combination.
Well, let me put that to John, because I think this is something that you both, I've seen in both of your work, is you talk about that kind of lowering the horizon of politics, lowering the temperature as a selling point, but it can also make liberalism feel hollow. Some people want to have a religious war. Some people want to live in interesting times, don't they? Some people get complacent under liberalism.
They want to live in interesting times until they become interesting.
Right.
Because when they become interesting, they very often also become violent. And when they become violent, very few people can be sure that they're safe. That's why, by the way, I think of one of the early modern thinkers, Thomas Hobbes, as a liberal. In that sense. He's often described as an absolutist or an authoritarian, but his idea of the state is strictly limited, maybe too limited, to go back to what Helen was saying. For Hobbes, the state is about preserving peace above all, and basically about preventing human beings from killing one another. Now, that might sound a terribly modest goal, but actually, if you look at human history as a whole, including that of Europe, and including now, it's not that modest, and it's something that can give strength to regimes that are otherwise very undesirable. So I have to say I regard many aspects of the current regime in China as very undesirable, particularly its persecution of minorities. But compared with the 20th century history of China, compared with the Cultural Revolution, compared with long periods of upheaval and anarchy and mass starvation and famine, some of them state-engineered, but others coming out of wars and so on, it has a basis of support in the preservation of peace. And that's a very, very strong, I think, as strong, if you like, as the occasional outbreak of the passion for war, because they're both real. I mean, I agree with pretty much most of what Frank has said. Particularly, he used the word tolerate. And I think if there was one thing that has characterized liberalism until recently, it's been the practice of toleration, which essentially is a judgmental practice. Because what you tolerate when you tolerate something is not something you like or love or even respect. You might actually hate it and think it's completely false and pernicious. But unless it passes beyond some really strong boundaries, you'll put up with it because that's the condition of living together in a kind of modus vivendi. And I think that's terribly important. That's what, to me, liberalism is basically about. But, rather key point here, there have been experiments in toleration outside the West and outside of liberalism. It's not uniquely Western. Buddhist India, for example, certain periods in the history of the Ottoman Empire, a different example. They weren't liberal because there weren't autonomous choices being made there. But communities learned to live together. Religions learned to live together. I think this even was attempted in a half-hearted way in Prussia. I seem to remember, I think it was Frederick the Great said something like, all religions will be tolerated as long as there aren't too many. I think he thought there were about 3, or way out, maybe 4. So this is not liberalism we're talking about, but it's a type of toleration, and that seems to me very important. Helen's question was, doesn't that feel hollow? Well, maybe I share Frank's view in this respect. I think one shouldn't look to politics for salvation, for human salvation, and one shouldn't look to politics even more for a meaning in life. If you do, you'll be terribly disappointed. I mean that very seriously, not as a joke. You should look at politics as a way of protecting yourself, people you care about, the things you value, so that you can enable to find or make a meaning in life and pursue the values that you like. I think the overvaluation of politics, especially in the 20th century, is what was one of the great errors of that time. But I'm afraid I found that infiltrating liberalism.
Well, let's come back to that, because I think
in 1989.
Well, everything comes back to 1989 eventually. But I think you're right to pick up on the fact that it was what I would see now as one of the left-wing challenges to liberalism is of politics as a form of religion, with all the attendant things. But I want to go back, because Frank, you have a very rare achievement, which is that all of this conversation is happening in the shadow of your work and your thinking. And The End of History is an often misquoted, misremembered book. Can you refresh us on what you were actually arguing then? Because it's the end of history with a capital H, right, which is very important. But what was the central thesis of that book?
Yes, well, let's see if I can think of that argument. I usually get asked it once or twice a day for the last 30 years. So
that is the price of success, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I have a lot of practice. Well, first of all, I would explain what the end of history, those words mean. So history is history with a capital H. Today we would call it something like modernization or development. That is to say, the slow evolution of human social organization over the millennia, as you go from hunter-gatherer societies to tribal societies to, feudalism to, an industrial society, and then wherever we are today. That's history. And then the end is not a stopping, it is the direction that progress is pointing us towards. And there was Karl Marx had he bought into the idea that there was history in this progressive sense, and he also talked about an end of history. For him, the end of history would be communism, because that was the highest form of human organization that resolved all of the contradictions of prior forms. And my observation back in 1989 was we weren't going to get there. We weren't going to get to this higher stage, that we could get to liberal democracy connected to a market economy, but it wasn't clear that there was another stage in social evolution higher than that, better than that, and that's where we would end up. I did not predict that everybody would end up being a peaceful, democracy, but I said that there is this larger process, call it modernization, that is valuable. People don't want to live in poor, chaotic, less developed countries. They want to live in, Switzerland or Canada or, Britain that has a high level of wealth, where you can educate your children. You don't have to worry about your physical security the way you do in many poor societies. And that's really what the meaning of the end of history was.
Which then leads me on to the question of why didn't that happen to Russia after the end of the Cold War? Why didn't it become a liberal democracy?
Well, I do think that there are, cultural traditions that can get in the way. I mean, so many factors. One of them was just bad policy. And I really do think that a lot of especially the American economic advisors that were talking to Russian policymakers after the Soviet Union fell apart gave them bad advice. They made a much too rapid transition to a market economy. They didn't have and it was based on a really fundamental misunderstanding. They didn't understand you need a state in order to have a market economy, a functioning state, and the Soviet Union had just dismantled its state. And so that was part of it. I think that, just the shock of losing an empire that rapidly was deeply traumatizing to a lot of people. It shouldn't have been, because I believe there's a country in this neighborhood that lost an empire at some point in the not too distant past, and it didn't go into this big revanchist, effort to reconquer lost territories. But I do think that there is a tradition in Russian national identity that understood its own identity in terms of the domination of its region, and that simply just didn't go away. And then, I think part of it is just the luck of particular leaders. And I think we've got a lunatic running this country right now who is just fixated on that, what he regards as a historical injustice. But you could have imagined other outcomes. Boris Yeltsin could have appointed somebody other than, a KGB agent to be the next president of Russia, and we may have been on a very different path.
Well, John, I want to challenge you a bit about the Ukraine situation, because one of the things I think has been surprising is how unified the Western response has been, how dignified the American response has been in letting Europe lead on it. Even countries like Switzerland joining sanctions regimes against Russia. That does show there's a bit of life in the old Western alliance yet, right?
Yes, it does, but let's not overdo it. I think in the last 3 weeks, something like 4 billion euros have been spent by the Germans on Russian gas. So they've been funding the Russian war machine by that amount. And if you take the whole of Europe, it's much, much larger. I just don't have a figure at my fingertips, but it's very big. The Americans, I think, and particularly Biden, who's, I think, quite often unjustly attacked president, have done very well. But let's not forget, as well as they could in these difficult circumstances, it was Biden last year who overrode Congress on the absolutely crucial geopolitical issue of the HST2 pipeline. This is, among other things, he's backed off. Later on, he said he altered, but basically he stymied those people in Congress who wanted to put an end to it, and that's an absolutely crucial feature of this war, because although Ukraine, huge producer of agricultural commodities, which is going to already has knock-on effects in places like Egypt, for example, it's a transit area for energy, and that's very, very important. So has the West really come together all that much? The huge change in German foreign policy lasted less than a week.
Well, it's going to up its defence spending,
somewhat,
for example, and it's paused the Nord Stream pipeline. So when did it backslide?
It backslid because they're nothing yet, as far as I know. Most of the weapons that Zelensky complained about this just 2 days ago, I think. Zelensky complained that most of the weapons that they were supposed to haven't arrived. Not much has arrived. Originally sold helmets. You remember what he said? Why didn't you send us pillows? That might have been some uses who are being killed en masse. Somewhere to lay our heads, perhaps. Nothing much has yet been done. And also, especially by Germany and by other European countries, European countries which have done magnificently, above all Poland, are those directly faced by Russian power. I'd also single out the Baltic states. But I think one can greatly overestimate this. Let's look a little bit deeper at this rise of the West for a couple of minutes. First of all, there has not been a global alliance of democracies against the axis of autocracy. This has not happened. India has not joined us. South Africa has not joined us. The United Arab Republics have not joined us. And China has not joined it. It's in a very difficult position. It doesn't know which side. Very, very ambiguous and equivocal. And yet, I find this very amusing that the people who say that the West is resplendent as never before look to China as the world's greatest, most powerful, most formidable autocracy for salvation. Maybe they and they alone can pull the rug from under Putin, not any of the West. So that tells you something about the state of power in the world. And I don't actually attack these. I myself I'm a very strong supporter of the Ukrainians. I think we should arm them as long as they want to fight with the best arms that we can give them. I do not favor a no-fly zone because that could lead to nuclear war. And to cite a statistic, which is I've checked, Russia has mini nukes, tactical nukes, which it's the official doctrine, the public doctrine of the Russian state, can be used first. And it has 10 times as many as NATO. It has about 2,000. NATO has about 200, of which 100 are in America. So if you're going to risk this catastrophe, it's a really very big catastrophe that you're risking. So I don't support a no-fly zone.
Well, can I bring in Frank on this? Because I think this is another question that has been floating around in the ether. I really want to know your take on it, which is, what looks from the outside to a non-informed observer, very botched invasion of Ukraine that ran into trouble has not been the kind of shock and awe and an installation of a puppet government. Does that suggest that a fundamental flaw in autocratic decision-making? That everyone is so scared of Putin that they won't tell him, well, actually, I think I've got a bad idea here?
Well, I'll answer that in a second. I disagree with John on just some facts. Weapons are pouring into Ukraine right now from a whole variety of European countries, including this one. Maybe not in the first instance, from Germany, but a lot of weapons are arriving. Ukrainians are doing much, much better than anyone expected, and I actually think that they can defeat Putin and force a withdrawal, not a negotiated settlement, but they can actually defeat the Russian army because they've been taking unsustainable casualties up to this point. And so I think the overall situation is much better than a lot of people are allowing for. But yes, I mean, Putin's decision-making in this case shows why you shouldn't have an autocracy and why it's not good for a society to be run by one person with no checks and balances. He seems to have retreated into a kind of shell, especially under the I mean, you saw these pictures of him meeting with his National Security Council, when they're all 25 feet away from them, and at the end of these long tables, apparently, all his ministers are triple vaccinated, but he still doesn't want to come within 20 feet of them. And it bespeaks, some mental paranoia or disturbance. He's also been completely consumed with these historical narratives, comparing himself to Peter the Great or Catherine the Great or prior, Russian rulers that extended the territorial reach of Russia. But the most important thing is that the invasion was planned so incompetently that, they're now paying a very, very heavy price for it. They didn't understand Ukraine. I mean, I have gone quite a lot over the last 7 years to Ukraine because we run a lot of programs to train young Ukrainians. And I think the Russians had no idea that Ukraine has actually become, at least with its elites, quite a liberal society, that you have a very westernized elite there that really want to be European, and that across the country, they don't want to be part of Russia. They simply did not understand that. And that's why they thought you could wage a 48-hour war, the Ukrainian army would surrender, you'd get a lot of collaborators that would run a pro-Putin Ukraine, and it shows what happens if you're cut off from basic information, and you're running a system where everybody wants to say something that they know will please you. You know, I can't imagine any, you know, I don't know if you saw that meeting where he berated Narishkin, the head of the FSB, in a very humiliating way.
I did, and I've never seen a spy chief look so worried that he was going to be getting a teapot with something in it.
And so your intelligence chief should be able to give you bad news, you know, if that's what the intelligence is telling you. But you can't do that in this country because everybody is too afraid of the guy on top. And so this is, you know, a general argument for more distributed power, you know, some constraints where you can't just do whatever you want, where you need to consult at least with a, you know, larger council. I mean, the Chinese created something like this after 1978, this collective leadership where, you know, the guy at the top couldn't make all the decisions. You'd have to get consensus. That didn't exist in Russia, and they're paying a really heavy price for this.
Now, John, I've been tough on Frank for writing The End of History, that he was arguing for a coherent and directional history of mankind that will eventually lead the greater part of humanity to liberal democracy. I'm now going to give you a rough time of what you wrote in your review of that. So cast your mind back
to
1989.
Yeah, okay.
You wrote, "The days of liberalism are numbered. But, here's my contention, it's limped on, and maybe that's all systems of government ever do. Maybe that's the best you can hope for."
That is the best you can hope for. I didn't mean that there would be no liberal societies left in the world. The view I expressed in there, as you remember, what I said in that article 33 years ago, was it wasn't history that had ended. What had happened was that history had resumed in a traditional or classical fashion. That history and future would be governed by resource wars, nationalism, religion, all the kind of forces that moved it in the past. And of course in that there would be some liberal societies which, if they disappeared, would disappear probably largely or morphed into something different because of problems within themselves, which I think Frank actually agrees with. I mean, at the end of his book, he talks in a way which could be seen as an anticipation not only of what is now called woke, but of also what liberals call populism. So I wasn't saying that there'd be no liberalism, but liberalism as a universal creed. Yeah. Liberalism as a universal creed, I thought, would begin to decline, as I think has happened. India is no longer a secular republic as imagined by the British. The Arab Spring did not end. There are illiberal democracies in parts of Eastern Europe. That has not happened. There hasn't been the universal advance of liberalism. Now, of course, you can always say, and Frank, don't you say, well, it's the long run. It's the long run that counts, the very long run. Well, an economist I admired said, in the long run, we're all dead. Maynard Keynes. And that might be not that much of a long run now, because just to take up briefly what Frank said, the Ukrainians are winning. Well, if they're winning, it's a point of maximum danger for the world. Because if they're winning, then Putin is not going to sue for peace on that basis. He's not going to go back to Russia and say, I've still got Crimea. He had Crimea to start with. Before this, he's going to be humiliated and possibly toppled. If he's toppled, by the way, it won't be by some as yet unknown Harvard graduate in liberal rights theory or economist. It'll most likely be someone from within the security apparatus. So we actually don't know what would come after. But if really they're winning, and I have nothing but admiration for what they've done and are doing, then he's repeatedly said, as I said, it's official military doctrine, that one can use these mini nukes, of which he's got lots more than we have. I think the Americans and Biden are right to say that there's probably a false flag operation being put into being about chemical and biological warfare. And don't forget, this is the Syrian playbook. We talk about this terrible war as if it has never happened before. Well, it hasn't happened recently in Europe. You'd have to go back 100 years to the Russian Civil War or something like that. But it did happen in Syria. city after city was obliterated, destroyed, hospitals were bombed, schools were bombed. This is the Aleppo and the Grozny playbook that he's operating with. So if anyone thinks he won't use these weapons, I think I would have to say perhaps rather sternly, you've not learned much from the last 3 weeks.
Well, let me put that to Frank, because I think that's really interesting. What do you think is the best outcome that we can hope for? Aside from John's theory that we won't get a New Statesman columnist as Russian president, the more's the pity. In the circumstances, what is the best possible outcome that is plausible?
Well, I think you can actually paint a pretty rosy scenario. If the Ukrainians really do defeat the Russians or force a withdrawal, it does seem to me that Putin is not going to survive this. There will be somebody in his security apparatus, maybe somebody in the army that will say, look, he's humiliated the country. He's put, there's actually this very interesting piece that was posted by a former hardline general named Ivashov about 3 weeks before the war, in which he said, attacking Ukraine is a stupid idea, and I think Putin ought to step down as president. And this is a very senior, retired military officer. And some of my Russian friends tell me that that's actually a very common feeling among the senior officer corps in the Russian military. They've now lost, the estimate is over 10,000 killed, meaning if you add the wounded, that's like 35,000 casualties out of their initial invasion force. So it's a really terrible setback for any professional military officer. I don't think that the successor is going to be worse. I don't think that the successor is going to have even greater ambitions to use this military in a yet more terrible way than Putin. And I actually think that there's a pretty powerful logic for not starting a nuclear war.
Yes, true.
So I don't want to minimize the danger of the moment, but I do think that it's possible that you could get a pretty big Russian retreat. If that happens, I think that there will be a feeling, among other democracies that they actually can do something about these negative trends that have been happening in the last few years. And if they stick together and if they support one another the way they're supporting Ukraine, that you can actually have good political outcomes. I think we've been suffering from this, liberalism fatigue or something. There have been so many people criticizing liberalism that nobody's kind of stood up and tried to explain why it's a good thing. You couldn't get a better illustration of why a liberal society is better than an autocratic one than what's happened between Russia and Ukraine, right?
Well, I was curious. When I was reading your back catalogue, I was thinking to myself, I was one of those times when you want to kind of get the author and ask them a few probing questions, and now I've got you here, so tough luck on you. Is there any system of government you would rather live under? For all your criticisms of liberalism, it is nice to have a free press and free elections, and Singapore is very clean, but also, you could get fined for jaywalking.
It depends on who you are. Would you prefer, if you were living in Detroit, would you prefer Detroit or Singapore? Now, you've got free speech in Detroit. If you're not one of the hundreds of thousands, I think now, of deaths of despair in the colossal opioid epidemic there. People don't only want free speech. Very important. I've lived by it, so I'm not going to attack it. I think it's a great thing. But there's no one single ideal type of government. For the rest of the life of everyone in this room, I think, there will be slightly tattered liberal democracies, there'll be illiberal democracies, there'll be autocracies, there'll be theocracies, there'll be ethnic nationalist states, there'll be civic nationalist states, and there'll be parts of the world where there's no state at all, just zones of anarchy. That's what will be for every single person in this room, in my view. There might be slightly more liberal democracies or slightly fewer, but there won't be a universal or even anywhere near a universal liberal democracy, because there's been 30-odd years since this prophecy or prediction or whatever it was. Frank didn't predict that there'd be no major conflicts. He never did. But he did think that there was no sustainable alternative to liberalism. Well, some regimes are so abominable that no one wants to live in them. Most are mixed. And legitimacy in regimes isn't a matter of fitting any theory like liberalism or Marxism or some other theory. It's a complicated thing to do with peace, prosperity, security, having rulers you can halfway trust or at least not 100% mistrust, who somehow reflect your values. It's a very complicated thing, and shifting all the time. And so that's, as it were, my answer to you. I should say one final thing on Putin. I think there's a great error, actually, an extremely dangerous error being unfolding at the moment, which is to say that Putin is mad. Now, he may be solid, he may be isolated. He shows many of the characteristics of isolation. There may be people not telling him the bad news. That might be why he'll seek scapegoats for the failure. He'll sack a lot of his people. He already has, military and intelligence. But when one says that, one is making the classic error of liberals, which is to say that underneath all human beings are rational in the sense that liberals understand rationality. What they really want is freedom, peace, prosperity. Or as I think Wolfowitz said about Iraq, he said, 2 years from now, they'll all be sitting reading the Wall Street Journal and checking their stock prices. Didn't happen. And not only because of American mistakes. This can lead to catastrophe because it leaves out the possibility of that a ruler like Putin with goals about reviving Russia in its Tsarist or perhaps its Soviet form, unifying it, having it as not be as a kind of a world historical force in the world, in human affairs. There is goals, and we leave out the possibility, which has been many times exhibited in history, that people will put as human beings, leaders, and even some of their followers, will put on one side these liberal goals, but apply some other goals instead. I think he is rational. He's been preparing this for a long time. He's turned the economy into a fortress. People say it's in free fall now. Well, they can probably still feed themselves because 80% of their food is domestically produced. It'll be other parts of the world, the developing world, that face shortages and hunger.
Well, let me pick up on that then, because you talk about the idea of a resource war, and I think, Frank, this is one of the things that I think is maybe a biggest challenge to politics in the 21st century is water wars, climate change during forced migration. Is there a fear in you that liberalism was a response to a particular set of political conditions and scarcity and the fight for the last few remaining places on earth that are still livable completely changes politics, that we are entering a new political era entirely?
Well, if things turn out, to be as dire environmentally as that, it's possible that a lot of our modern institutions will, begin to break down. And, I think that one of the big advantages of liberal societies is economic growth. If you have economic growth, then inequality can be managed in certain ways, because if everybody is getting a little bit richer, the fact that some people are getting more rich, more quickly is tolerable. If you basically move into a world where growth doesn't happen, then you're back in this Malthusian world where the only way I can get rich is by taking something from you. And so predation becomes a major way that entrepreneurs then amass fortunes by stealing from other people. And I think that it's pretty hard to maintain a liberal society in a world without economic growth. And that's why, climate change is a big challenge, because if there's no way of breaking the link between emitting carbon and growth, then you're basically saying, if you're going to save the planet, you're going to have to stop growing. And there are, in fact, greens that support degrowth and, other things that I think are politically pretty hard to swallow. So yes, I do think that's a problem. However, I don't believe that the regime type actually makes a difference in your attitude towards growth, because authoritarian regimes want to grow too, right? China wants to grow, and in fact, it's going to be the major emitter of carbon, between now and 2050. and it's got an authoritarian regime. And so I don't think that moving away from liberal, so the environmental crisis may weaken our commitment to liberalism, but I don't think that authoritarian government is a solution to the environmental crisis. By the way, John, I just have to make a comment on so I agree with you basically that you'll have all these different kinds of regimes in the world, and it may not be the case that the liberal ones will necessarily be dominant, but there's one fact that I think is indicative of which is the best regime, and that's kind of the question that was posed that you skipped over. And I think people are voting with their feet, right? There are hundreds of thousands of people every single year that escape from chaotic, poor, badly governed places. And where do they choose to go? Do they go to Russia? Do they go to China? Do they go to North Korea? No. They go to liberal societies because I think that everybody has this perception that they want to live, if they had the opportunity, they want to live in a law-governed, stable country that is well-to-do, gives their children opportunities, for education, for socially advancing themselves. And so I think people are voting with their feet, and they're voting to live in liberal societies.
Sure, that is a strong tendency. I don't deny that. But let's think. By the way, one slightly tragic fact is that the efflux now, the exiting of liberal, or not necessarily liberal, but of Russians who can't stand living under Putin, is happening in almost to the day that the philosophers' steamships left Russia. I don't know if any of you know about those. 100 years ago, Lenin sent out a message throughout the intelligentsias, theologians, ballerinas, musicians, linguists. You've got to follow, if you want to stay in Russia, he told, this was Lenin, not Stalin, you've got to accept that your freedom will be curtailed. So for those of you who don't like this prospect, we're providing steamships to take you out. And 2 steamships followed by trains, they were all left, very famous musical and theological and other figures. Now, it was exactly 100 years ago, the same thing is happening. So this is something, it has to be said about Russia, a tragic, extremely gifted culture, but a tragic one. But I think the basic difference between Frank and myself is not that I deny that liberal societies have done well and are pretty good to live in, but that I can't see them as a universal goal, and not only that I can't, most of humankind can't actually now. Is it the case that beneath these autocracies there are populations which just long to be American, just can't wait to be? I don't think so. I think that they perceive deep weaknesses in Western liberalism that are real. What has happened in the last 20 years? Well, there was a huge financial crisis. There were a series of spectacularly incompetent and hubristic wars, not just Afghanistan and then Iraq, but also Libya. They've seen the West not so much hollowed out as full of itself. Just one comment on this. I don't actually think that liberalism as an ideology in the political class is in as much decline as Frank says. I think that in some ways, unfortunately, it's still very strong. Let me give you an example. The most dangerous proposal around at the moment, apart from no-fly zone, is a second Nuremberg.
As in a war crimes tribunal?
As a war crimes tribunal.
Yeah.
To put up Putin and his cronies for war crimes. Now, they have committed war crimes. There's no doubt about that. But there's a difference between where we are now in 2022 and 1942. In 1942, Hitler didn't have the bomb. If this becomes official policy and Putin and his cronies realize that they can be standing in the dock there, what does that do to give them any incentive to wind down, to de-escalate? It means it's an existential choice of life and death with them. Then I think that as if the Ukrainians continue winning, they'll up the ante, they'll escalate. It's not just me who thinks this, the Americans think this. American intelligence thinks this. British intelligence made public statements that they fear that this is what is going to happen. So maybe we should have another similar conversation, maybe a year from now or even sooner, because I actually think that the axis of these events, it'll either drag on this terrible war, like in Syria, for years and years and years. It's a possibility. Or there might be a rapid Russian crumbling of their army with very low morale and so on. But then I don't think one can bet on Putin being removed and even being replaced by anyone substantially better. It would probably be, I think Frank would agree, someone from within the security apparatus, because only they have got the opportunity to remove him. You can't get to him.
But equally, I won't, as you say, let anyone within 20 feet of him, which is probably, I mean, again, it comes out to, is that actually a very rational thing to do if you're Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think the problem here is that liberals are so confident of their idea of rationality that they think that all other human beings basically have it, and if they don't, they're crazy. I knew a Polish sociologist called Stanislaw Andrzejewski, probably a forgotten name. He wrote many books, but one was called Social Sciences as Sorcery. Even the title's worth buying the book for. It's a very good book. He was captured in Poland in the Second World War by the Soviets as a young man and marched into the woods. As he was being marched into the woods, his comrades were told, "You will get cigarettes, you will get hot water, you will get food." He told me that what he did was he told one of the guards, "I need to relieve myself." He went behind a bush and just didn't come out. His comrades were never heard of again, and probably were among the 23,000 Poles who were murdered in the Katyn massacre. And I asked him, "Well, why did you do that? Is it because we're both pessimists?" He was a great pessimist. He said, "No," he said, "I just didn't believe it." And I never got further with that to him, but I think what he was thinking was, you've got to ask what the goal of the person you think is irrational is. If their goal, the Soviet goal at that time, was the same as the Nazi goal, which I think it was, which is to destroy the Polish intelligentsia, then what they were doing by killing was rational. And what the soldiers who were marching unknown to their deaths were, or the captive soldiers, what was doing was irrational, because they were counting on liberal rationality. He told me they were saying, well, they'll need our labor. They're not inefficient, the Germans, after the Soviets, they are inefficient, but they'll need our leader, they'll need our labor. They didn't. They had different goals. So if Putin's goals are really what he says they are in his extraordinary 5,000-word essay on Polish and Ukrainian history, if that's what he really thinks, did he do it as a joke? I don't think so. There's even less evidence of humor in Putin than there was in John Stuart Mill. If he really thinks that, is he prepared to bring the house down for it?
Well, we're going to go to questions in 5 minutes, but before that, you mentioned the W word. I would like it on record that I didn't say the W word, woke. So 5p in the swear jar for you. But this is a topic of at home. I think great angst among, whether you want to call them the intelligentsia or op-ed columnists, whoever it might be, the idea that liberalism is not just under threat from autocrats, but also from a new type of leftism that, again, doesn't have what you would say tolerance for diversity. It believes there's the right side of history and that people got to be on it, and some questions have just been settled. Is that, so the New York Times, for example, ran an op-ed this week for a leader from the editorial board saying there is a free speech crisis in America, and people lost their minds on Twitter because they say, come on, this is absolutely nothing compared to the real problem out there, which is the right. Where do you stand on that?
I agree in general that the immediate political threat to liberal values comes from the right. I mean, basically, stealing the next presidential election, that's pretty serious. But the cultural threat that's posed by the progressive left is also serious. It comes out of a different interpretation of identity politics that is definitely illiberal. So there's one version of identity politics that is the fulfillment of liberalism, which is really the politics of Martin Luther King, right? He wanted black people to be treated exactly the same way that white people were treated, so they could be part of a broader, mainstream. But the way that the progressive understanding of identity has evolved, the particular, fixed characteristics like race, gender, ethnicity, and so forth become essential characteristics that then determine the way that society distributes rewards. It becomes something that, where social justice is allowed to override other liberal principles like freedom of speech, like due process. And a lot of the critique that, on which this kind of understanding of identity politics is based is explicitly anti-liberal. It regards, a little bit like Herbert Marcuse in an earlier age, that liberalism is just a sham. You may think that you're living in a free society, but in fact you're living in a racial patriarchy that is manipulated by, sinister people behind the scenes. They want to make you think that you're living in a free society, but you're really not. And I think that is a view that's taken hold in certain parts of the left, and it's cultural rather than political, but I do think that it's, it is a threat to liberal values.
But this is what I struggle with, because I write on both sides of this line. If you look at feminism, perhaps, and the first wave of feminism, the suffragettes, that was a demand to be treated equally. Everyone should have the vote. We're all equal citizens. The trouble then comes when you move forward in time and you say, well, actually, men and women have different biologies, and one side's got to do the unequal investment in rearing the children, and therefore you need a special set of policies. You have to be treated differently. And I think you could say the same thing about police shootings in America, the disproportionate effect of them on black men. How do you raise the consciousness required to assert your particular rights as a group and the unfair treatment without, as you say, essentializing it and that making it everything to be seen through that? That's why I've never understood.
So that's true enough. I mean, identity politics is an important and time-tested way of mobilizing people, right, and making them conscious of injustice. But I guess the question then is, what do you do about it, and what is your ultimate objective? And if the objective is actually to, do things that in effect do essentialize these characteristics, then you're moving away, I think, from a liberal society that really does see a kind of underlying universal humanity behind, people, regardless of what their gender, cultural, experience, race, all these other characteristics are. And I think, there are many societies that are organized that way. Lebanon is organized that way. Iraq is organized that way. Bosnia is organized that way, where you have these fixed identity groups, and they're all engaged in a kind of zero-sum contest over resources, among each other. And I think, compared to that, if they're kind of stuck in that kind of consciousness, and I don't really see how they get out of it. But if you are a society where you still have the ability to treat people as individuals, you ought to stick to that, before you move too far down the road to, to being Bosnia with its 3 presidents and 3 parliaments and 3 police forces and, so on and so forth.
And John, you've had some fairly heterodox opinions over the years, often profoundly out of step with the prevailing consensus. Is it harder now to speak than it was?
I've been extremely lucky. I think it is hard. I left academia before the problem. I left academia in 2007, before this became an issue in academia. But I know that within academia, young academics are extremely careful in what they research, what they say, what they even say in canteens, because it could be held against them. That's a sign of a society or a culture or a way of life that's gone a long way from liberalism. Because there used to be a private realm when you could say what you like and there would be no comeback. And it even extended to your colleagues at work. You might have professional rivalries. You would have, because they're normal in workplaces. But you wouldn't be afraid of being snitched on 6 months later and your career wrecked. So it's really real. People who say, when I say the woke is a problem, they say, well, what about you? You're constantly giving public events, and this is the first one I've given for 2.5 years, never mind.
But that is the thing, isn't it? Cancel culture isn't real because you don't look very cancelled.
That's right, but there are not many of us, and I'm retired. So I'm not in the same position as young scholars are, or young journalists in some organizations or young workers in some corporations. It's absolutely real. And if you ask what woke is, it's liberalism without tolerance. It's hyper-liberalism. It's the idea of autonomy understood in a certain kind of way, but taking out of it the cultural and civilization and religious and other matrices in which it developed, and taking out of it tolerance. And I must say, back to Mill, who I still revere in many ways, he was a very serious, careful thinker. He has something, there's something in him he has some responsibility for this, because in a crucial chapter in his On Liberty, people always quote the chapter on freedom of speech, which is a good chapter in many ways. The chapter on individuality says that anyone who doesn't make themselves, doesn't define themselves, doesn't create themselves, aren't really human. In other words, if you're a traditional religious practitioner, if you're an Orthodox Jew or a traditional Catholic or Muslim, or you're just somebody who knocks through life without ever working out what you want or who you are, you're quite happy just to bumble your way through life. You haven't really made it as a human being. You're a human being when you have individuality, which means you create and invent yourself. And one of the problems about that is, the key problem, which Frank just referred to in these other societies, is that if you create an identity for yourself, you've also got to have it recognized by society. You've got to have it validated by society. And then the kind of Hobbesian war, the war in which you can only get power or position from someone else, you can only get resources from other people, breaks out again, because then you say, well, I'm a member of this group, and this group isn't getting what it wants, and I demand that it gets acceptance. And sometimes, of course, as both Helen and Frank have said, there's a huge background of oppression and discrimination, which makes this a legitimate claim in many ways. The trouble is, it fragments society. It creates a kind of professional struggle. There's a Russian theorist I mentioned to Helen before we came on stage, who's got the theory of surplus elites. Just too many of them about. They're not all needed or wanted. Too many lawyers, too many aspiring novelists, too many poets, too many human rights. They've got hundreds and thousands. The figures, I think, back this up, at least in America. Where are they going to sort of find themselves somewhere? So they're battling it out in this slightly cynical. The Russians in America have been there for many years, but they're battling it out under it's a kind of ideology of self-promotion. I don't think it's that or only that. I think it's a genuine mutation in liberalism. And that's one of the reasons I do feel concerned about the future of liberal societies. A time will come when no one remembers the kind of tolerance that perhaps many of us here, younger than me even, do remember, in which you can't say without anxiety what's on your mind. You have to self-censor. And once that happens, the game's up.
Well, if it makes you feel better, I had my voice removed from a video game for saying that biological sex exists, which must be one of the most absurd cancellations of the 21st century. But that's probably a good time to turn to questions. I've got one mic over there. This side of the audience, you're going to have to bellow at me, because John's stolen your mic. I've got a mic up in the centre. Could I take one from this side of the room? I'm afraid you'll have to make your way to the microphone. Could someone make their way to the microphone upstairs? And can I make a plea for women to ask questions, because I think they're often a bit hesitant about coming forward, and I love a mouthy woman. I am a mouthy woman. And is there anyone upstairs who wants to... Oh, okay,
Sorry.
Great. If anyone upstairs could make their way to the mic if you want to ask a question. Hello.
Hi, Alex Willard. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful debate so far. When you say obsolete, do you really mean relevant? And are we confusing liberalism with democracy? And I guess that comes full around to saying, do you really think that the USA is still liberal in any shape or form?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, let's try and do them all. Let's do that first one, because you alluded to the next election being stolen, and I think the question to what extent the US is a liberal democracy is a kind of interesting one. So let's start there.
Well, I wrote this book about liberalism and not about democracy and not about liberal democracy, because you have this phenomenon on the populist right where you get popularly elected leaders that are democratically legitimated through elections. So that's Erdogan, Orban, the Law and Justice Party in Poland. There's no question that democratically they represent a very powerful part of their societies. And the first thing they attack is not democracy, it's the liberal part It's the rule of law. They want to undermine the judiciary's independence. They want to muzzle the free press that could criticize them, and basically escape the kinds of constitutional checks and balances that should limit executive power. So it's really the liberal values that come under attack in the first instance. Now, once they succeed in doing that, they also then go on to attack the democratic leg as well by gerrymandering and denying access to the vote, various people. So the two are actually related to each other. I think that the United States, yes, it is still a liberal society. The limitations on freedom are, the sort of self-censorship that John is talking about. In terms of political speech, you're getting some conservative state legislatures that are passing rules about what you can teach in schools, and that's worrisome. But it's not a huge impact. Basically, you can say whatever the hell you please, in the United States, and nobody is going to hold you to account. And I think the rule of law is still very powerful. Trump was not allowed to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do because you had jurists and judges that wouldn't let him do that. So I think that the institutional checks are still there, but they're weaker. And that's what's really worrisome, because like all of these other populists, he is going to use a democratic mandate, if he manages to get into power again, to further erode those liberal institutions. And that's the point at which I think your question will then become really relevant.
But John, let me put the same question to you. Surely, as you said, some of the discontent in the US with liberal democracy is due to the financial crisis, due to the foreign policy disaster that was the Iraq War. Do you think that, a republic, if you can keep it, do you think a liberal democracy, if you could keep it, is that the people are reluctant to defend liberal democracy in the US?
Well, there isn't a good alternative to liberal democracy in the US. It may not exist anymore in the way that it did exist. I actually think that it's more compromised than Frank has argued just now. I wonder if a far-right candidate, maybe Trump, or maybe someone more intelligent than Trump, wouldn't be that hard in many ways, more disciplined, more like Orban. Supposing someone wins in a couple of years' time, and liberals say the election's been stolen. Some of them have already been writing that way now, even before it may not happen, but if it does happen, they say, well, we won't accept it. It's illegitimate because so that speaks to me of a very polarized society in which neither side accepts the legitimacy of the other. So that's a very bad sign. But there's no alternative. I do not share the view of some on the American cultural right who looked to Russia or to Hungary as a kind of bastion of traditional virtues. Perhaps they aren't aware that the country in the world with the highest level of abortion, I don't think abortions are wrong, by the way, but they do, is Russia. It has all of the problems and conflicts, addiction, broken families, in spades that the West have. These are the people who are still. Tucker Carlson, the TV host, I don't know if any of you know his name, just the other day said, "Well, I'm on the side of Putin. At least he's he's not woke. Well, he certainly isn't woke." But I think it's more. I think America is in greater trouble, especially if you think not against the background of a pretty decent performance by Biden, but what might happen in 2 years' time. What will that mean for the West? Because frankly, with all this stuff about the revival of Europe, supposing there wasn't the American security guarantee of Europe, supposing it wasn't there, supposing it had gone with Trump or before Trump, so that the Baltic states and all these peripheral states like Poland didn't have the American nuclear umbrella, what would have happened if Putin, we still rely really completely on the Americans? So I think it's a very important issue of how far America can still be relied on in that way.
But did that give you pause for thought? Because it did me. That alliance of the people who see themselves as you say, anti-woke, Tucker Carlson being one example, who went to Hungary year before, and hung out with Viktor Orban. Jordan Peterson, again, went for a sort of one-on-one interview, was photographed with him. That, for some people, the anti-wokeness has tipped them into a softness. Is that something that you see as a problem on the right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's not a softness, it's a madness. Because although the issues around woke are important, and I think we should treat them seriously, they're not as important as having your whole city ravaged and reduced to rubble. They're not as important as a potential nuclear war. They're not as important as a large-scale war breaking out in the middle of Europe for the first time since the end of they are important, they're very important, they're not as important. So people who determine the world in terms of these cultural wars, I think have just lost all human perspective. They've lost the sense of what really matters to human beings. Well, they spend a lot of time in television studios, so...
Yes, television studios and Twitter, the two places that will melt your brain. I have an online question for you, Frank, which is essentially posing the Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, right? Which is paradox of liberalism is tolerance of belief sets which are themselves intolerant. How do you have a liberal society which allows ultra-Orthodox Jews or Islamists or whoever it might be, fundamentalist Christians, to live within it?
Well, look, the liberal principle of tolerance does not extend to people that would undermine that liberal order. So you can't tolerate everybody. And I would say that, with these religious groups, the degree to which you tolerate them really depends on the way they treat their fellow citizens. So if you have an Islamist that is plotting, violence, then that, is a criminal act, and that needs to be suppressed. If it's an Orthodox, Jew that is living within a closed community and not bothering anybody, then I think the liberal principle would say, leave well enough alone. So that's the working out of the principle of tolerance. I strongly agree with John that one of the big problems in the interpretation of liberalism these days is that we've moved from tolerance to basically demanding a kind of uniformity of thought. It's not just enough to punish bad behavior that's racist or sexist, but you want people to have, certain private beliefs and express them, in private settings. And that's not a liberal society. That's something, that's something different, because the fundamental, virtue in a liberal society is tolerance. And there are different kinds of intolerance. So a lot of conservatives in the United States, basically, they don't want to tolerate, the changing racial, gender characteristics of their society. On the left, they don't want to tolerate conservatives, or they don't want to tolerate, religious people, and they want, a uniformity of thought from those groups as well. And so there's different types of intolerance that are creeping into the society, but pushing from tolerance to actually, demanding that people think a certain way, I think is fundamentally illiberal,
One of my favourite blog posts by Slate Star Codex is entitled, "I can tolerate everything except the outgroup." Right? which is the point. So people say, well, of course I'm incredibly tolerant of LGBT people, and you go, well, do you think that's, do you think it's a sin to be LGBT? And they go, no. And you go, so you're not actually tolerating that, you just agree with them, right? The measure of tolerance is tolerating people with whom you disagree.
I think there is a really difficult problem in this. I agree wholeheartedly with what Frank has said, but I think it's a really difficult problem to which liberals and everyone else doesn't really have a solution to. It's called children. To what extent can children be brought up within the closed society that their parents choose to live, in which they live? In other words, if you choose to live in I won't name them because it'll be considered a slur, but in some community which closes off other opportunities for information, and if you're physically separated, as some religious communes have been in the United States and elsewhere, is that a violation of the autonomy of the child? And if so, should the state intervene to protect the autonomy of the child? Or is it an example Should that be tolerated because it's the freedom of the parents to live the way they want? Or is it a restriction of the child's freedom to find out how many ways there are to live? And who will then provide that? I don't think that's been solved in any country fully, because it involves conflicts of values, conflicts of freedom. You might even say conflicts of toleration. Who is it that you, and how far are you? And I think that's endemic. It's not just extremists who kill others or attack others who are a problem for liberal toleration. It's people who actually just stay within their own communities, but bring their children up fully within those communities and make it hard for them to stray, or make the cost of exit inordinately high. They can leave physically, they can get on a train and go to London or something, but the cost is inordinately high for them because they haven't known about the rest of the world.
But that's one of the reasons I feel guilty, not to be rude about America, but feel grateful to live here, where actually what's on the curriculum is, it's of interest to parents, but it hasn't become the curriculum wars that we're now beginning to see in the States, because as you say, that's where the real fight is. You can say other adults can believe what they want, but everyone has a stake in what children are told. I'm just going to take a question from up there, and are you waiting to ask a question too? So let's have your question first, please.
So in thinking about identity politics and woke culture more generally, and the resulting polarization, do you think that, particularly in context of perhaps the million marketplace of ideas where you're supposed to be exposed to all the ideas before coming to the right one, has social media exacerbated our inability to come to conclusions as a society? And if so, to what extent?
That's brilliant. We'll come back to that. And then may I just take yours as well?
For Mr. Gray, I wanted to ask what form of government you believe humans should ideally be under, and whether that form of government has any room for liberalism.
It's going to be playing top trumps with forms of governments. And there was someone, if you could just say it out loud and I'll repeat it back to the room.
Yeah, sure. So it was about Frank's definition of liberalism at the beginning, mentioning the protection of rights, constitutional mechanisms, limiting the power of the state, and the equality of citizens, all being pretty fundamental to his concept of liberalism. And they're things that I, as you were saying, that was thinking of being eroded in the UK over the last 20 years. And it was kind of interesting to me that in everything tonight that the word neoliberalism hasn't actually been said, hasn't been used. And it's why, in some sense to me, actually, John, your analogy with Detroit and Singapore is like a missing point. So I don't think you could look at the last 30 years necessarily of US politics and look at that as being characterised by liberalism as opposed to neoliberalism. So my question really for both of you, with those things in mind, is what threat do you think neoliberalism poses?
That's great, and I know you've written about this in the book, so we'll cover that. So, but let's do that one first. So, neoliberalism as distinct from liberalism.
Well, 2 of the 10 chapters in my book are about neoliberalism, because I think, my argument is that both on the right and on the left, good liberal ideas were pushed to extremes where they became unsupportable. And so with neoliberalism, I define that as basically Milton Friedman and the Chicago School that then, leads to policies by Thatcher and Reagan that erode the state, that undermine its legitimacy, and that create a kind of market economy that exaggerates inequalities and promotes them, and then undermines the social protections that were meant to soften, those differences. And that was a big mistake, and that's one of the reasons you get the left-wing reaction to it, to this rising inequality. But I don't think it's a necessary characteristic of liberalism itself. You can dial back economic policy. You can expand the welfare state. You can provide more social protections. You can change the tax laws. And that's actually, I think, what's going on in a lot of societies today, including the United States.
And then let's have your top.
Well, my whole belief is that there isn't an ideal form of government. There are just lots of different ones, and at any particular time, some are better than others. And the reasons they're better are sometimes liberal reasons about freedom and rule of law, but sometimes they're about peace and security. And they don't always go together because there are conflicts, actually. These values, there are universal human values, there really are, I think. but they don't compose a harmonious set. They often compete with each other. You might want a very high degree of individual free speech. And you might even want that as much as the Americans wanted when they allow free speech by Nazis and anti-Semites and racists. I don't share that American absolutism about free speech at all. I'm happy that most countries in the world, including most European countries and Britain, protect other people from hate speech. Because one shouldn't think only of the freedom of the speaker, one should also think of the freedom and dignity of those who are spoken about.
Well, that leads us very naturally into the question about social media, right? Because that is the challenge of social media, John, to liberalism, is that you get a kind of heckler's veto. And that's both a sort of left liberal, one person's offence immediately derails the conversation.
Well, it connects up with what the speaker was asking, the question he was asking earlier on about neoliberalism and woke liberalism. See, I think my view is slightly different from Frank's here. I think there's a risk of essentialising liberalism. Liberalism is the good bit. Liberalism is the welfare state. Liberalism is
so no true liberal Scotsman is what you're saying. That well, you always define it as the bit you like.
Well, I remember there's an Austrian writer called Robert Musil who mocked this, and he has one of his characters say, well, true liberalism, true socialism, and true Christianity are basically all the same. Well, you know, they're not. They're different. And I think liberalism has gone through many different phases. It's not just one thing. It's like an extended quarreling family of things. But I do think woke liberalism and neoliberalism weren't just arbitrary distortions of underlying liberal principles. They grew out of certain problems that liberals didn't know how to solve. They grew out of certain real difficulties in practice. It wasn't just grabbed by conspirators who said we're going to turn liberalism into something intolerant and something awful. So I think there are problems all the way back to liberalism, actually, which is why I think there are some things which should be living in liberalism. Tolerance is one of the key things. And other parts of liberalism are or should be dead, or at least regarded as obsolete in the sense of no longer relevant.
Well, let me put a sort of version of that. One of the most interesting interviews I've done this year was with an academic called Karen Stenner, who researches authoritarianism. And her belief is that about a third of people in any society have what she calls the authoritarian predisposition. They value oneness and sameness in societies. Which is, as John was saying, if you live in somewhere that's chaotic and anarchic, what you fundamentally want is people not to come knocking on your door and stealing your stuff. But in liberal democracies, that becomes a problem because, as you say, those are set up to manage diversity. The cacophony of them, of people's competing ideas, this marketplace of ideas, for those people is intolerable and makes them want everyone to be the same. Is that intellectually something that you feel is appealing as an explanation?
Yes, I think that actually some people want to expand their realm of autonomy. They want more choice. They want to be left alone to make their decisions, but other people want the opposite. You know, they actually want to be told who they are because they're confused. And, you know, one of the big problems in a liberal society is there's so many identities that you could adopt, and the society gives you no guidance as to, you know, which is the best way of life that you should pursue. And that is what I think makes people join cults and join movements that anchor their identity in something, you know, stable, because I do think that there's a side of, you know, human nature that you know, craves that kind of stability. If I could just add to the question about social media, it does seem to me the internet in general has put us in this very difficult situation. So in a liberal society, we agree that we're not going to agree on the most important ultimate questions, but we used to at least agree on factual information, like who won the last election, you know, are vaccines safe and effective, you know, this sort of thing. And because I think of the rise of the internet, we no longer agree on that because we can live in parallel information universes since there is no authority on these social media platforms that distinguishes good information from bad information. And that is a very serious problem, and we've not figured out how to solve that.
Now we're running out of time, and so I just need to say that copies of both men's books will be on sale in the foyer. Frank will also be able to sign for a minute. I have to ask you one final question, which is, you have been having this argument since 1989. It's not quite the Keynesian long run, but it's a pretty long run. Who's winning so far?
Oh, we're both winning. We're both winning.
Oh, right, okay, that's a nice consensual note.
Or we're both losing.
And how much of your thinking has affected each other? What things have you taken from each other? Because you've quoted John in your book, right? You've nicked his definition of liberalism. So.
What I took from John is, at least two really good, great books about the liberal tradition, where he goes through all of the major thinkers, and you don't have to read their books. You just read John's book, and you know all about John Stuart Mill and all of these other great minds. But I think that John kind of understands the theory of liberalism, from the inside out, and it's a great achievement of his.
Well, I can tell you what I've learned from Frank, and I think you should all read his original book and his subsequent books, of which there are many: book on trust, book on political order. But the first book that hit me was, and the article before that, but it was The End of History and the Last Man, and practically no one reads the last chapters. And if you want an inkling, more than an inkling, of woke and populism, as it came to be called, it's in there. These are the internal pathology of liberal societies is anticipated in Frank's early work 30 years ago. So I understood that then. We differed as to what would happen next, and we even differ as to what's happening now. But in terrible, tragic, heartrending case of Ukraine. But we do, I think, share this. I think one thing we have in common, which is that, in a sense, the big question about politics, at least in the West, is still about the fate of liberalism. That's the big question. If you haven't thought that through, and thought through it seriously, you haven't thought through what's about to come, whether it's a revival of liberalism or a further deformation of it in some way or other, like neoliberalism was and woke liberalism is, or some kind of drift, which may be the most likely, because that's what I think most of history is.
Well, there we go. To understand this subject, I can't think of two better people to listen to. As I said, their books will be available outside. If you pre-ordered a book, it will be available in the foyer. But for now, John Gray and Francis Fukuyama, thank you very much.
Thank you.